The person who meant the least to them, they stayed. You noticed that, didn't you? The connections that were surface level, the relationships that never went anywhere real, the people who never quite got in, those ones, the avoidant kept around, casual, easy, undisturbed. But you, the one who actually got through, the one they laughed with at 2 a.m. and looked at differently and let in further than they'd probably let anyone in a long time. You're the one they ran from. And if nobody has said this to you clearly yet, let me say it now. That is not a coincidence. That is the pattern. And understanding why that pattern exists is going to change the way you see everything that has happened between you. Because right now, the story you're probably telling yourself is a story about not being enough, about doing something wrong, about being too much or not enough, or arriving at the wrong time, or loving in the wrong way. And that story is not just painful, it's inaccurate. And carrying an inaccurate story about why someone left or why someone keeps leaving in small ways even while they stay is one of the most quietly destructive things you can do to yourself. So let's replace it with what's actually true. Let's talk about what running really means when it comes from an avoidant. Let's talk about why the intensity of what they feel is the very thing that sends them out the door. And let's talk about what you do with that, whether they're already gone or still here but disappearing in increments. What the running actually means, most people interpret being left or being distanced from as a verdict, as the other person making a declaration about your worth, about whether you are lovable enough, interesting enough, stable enough, good enough to stay for. The leaving feels like a judgment, like they weighed you and found you wanting. But avoidant withdrawal, real avoidant withdrawal, the kind that happens with the people they feel most deeply about, is not a verdict about you. It is a verdict about the feeling itself, about what the feeling is doing inside them, about how terrifying it is to want someone this much and have no idea what to do without wanting. Here is the psychology underneath the running, and it starts much earlier than you. An avoidance attachment system was shaped in an environment where emotional closeness was not safe. That safety wasn't violated necessarily through cruelty or dramatic trauma, though sometimes it was. Often it was quieter than that. A parent who was emotionally unavailable, a caregiver who was present physically but absent emotionally, an environment where expressing need was met with withdrawal, dismissal, or a subtle but consistent message that your emotional world was inconvenient. Too much, better kept to yourself. And so the child, because this is a child we're talking about, a small person trying to make sense of the people they depend on entirely for survival, made an adaptation. They learned to need less, or more precisely, they learned to feel less of what they needed, to turn down the volume on attachment hunger until it became almost inaudible, to become self-sufficient in a way that looked like independence, but was actually a form of emotional self-amputation. That adaptation kept them safe. It worked, and the nervous system does not abandon what works, even decades later, even when the original threat is long gone, even when the person standing in front of them is nothing like the caregivers who made closeness feel dangerous. So now they're an adult, and they meet you, and something happens that their system was not fully prepared for. You get in. Not just a little, all the way in. You reach something that their carefully constructed distance was designed to protect. And the feelings that start to emerge, the genuine attachment, the caring, the vulnerability, the sense that losing you would actually mean something, those feelings are not just unfamiliar. They are, to their nervous system, existentially threatening. Because here is what deep feeling means to an avoidance system at a subconscious level. It means dependence, and dependence means vulnerability. And vulnerability means that someone now has the power to devastate them. And their entire psychological architecture was built to ensure that no one would ever have that power again. You didn't do anything wrong. You did everything right. You got close, and getting close to them activated the oldest alarm they have. Why the feeling itself becomes the threat. This is the part that breaks people when they finally understand it. Because it means the love is real. It means the connection was real. It means they weren't performing when they were close to you. They genuinely felt it. And then they ran. Not despite the feeling, because of it. The stronger the feeling, the louder the alarm. The more real the connection, the more urgent the need to escape it. Not escape you specifically. Escape the state of vulnerability that you represent. Escape the terrifying exposure of being someone who needs, someone who could be hurt, someone who has, against all their careful internal architecture, allowed themselves to want something they cannot fully control. Think about what it means to want someone you cannot control, to care about the outcome of something you have no guarantee over. Every person who loves another person lives with this uncertainty, the uncertainty of whether it will last, whether the other person will stay, whether the love is mutual and sustained. Most people with secure attachment can tolerate that uncertainty. It's uncomfortable, but it doesn't feel fatal. For an avoidant, that uncertainty doesn't feel uncomfortable. It feels like standing at the edge of something with no bottom. The potential for loss, the sheer uncontrollable potential for it, is not a background hum they can live with. It is a deafening noise that their system responds to by doing the only thing it knows how to do. Leave first. Pull back first. Create the distance before the distance gets created for them. There's a phrase in attachment theory that describes this. The avoidant would rather feel the pain of leaving than the pain of being left. And while that framing is useful, it undersells the depth of what's happening. It's not just a preference for one kind of pain over another. It's an automatic, pre-conscious protective maneuver that happens before they've even fully registered that they're doing it. They don't always know they're running. Sometimes they experience it as simply needing space, as things moving too fast, as suddenly noticing flaws they hadn't noticed before. A phenomenon called devaluation, where the mind helpfully manufactures reasons that the relationship isn't that important, that the person isn't that special, that the feelings were probably exaggerated. The devaluation isn't malicious, it's protective. It's the psyche doing what it does when it needs to make the leaving feel justified, feel logical, feel like a decision rather than a panic response. And you felt that devaluation, didn't you? That shift where you went from someone they seemed to treasure to someone they seemed almost indifferent to, where the warmth disappeared and was replaced by a kind of cool neutrality that felt nothing like the person you knew. That wasn't them revealing who they really are. That was them protecting themselves from how much they feel. The specific trigger, why you and not someone else. Let's address the thing that haunts most people in this situation. Why did the avoidant stay comfortable with certain people but run from you? Why did lesser connections survive when this one, the one with real depth, real feeling, real potential, is the one that got destroyed? The answer lives in the concept of emotional activation. An avoidance system doesn't respond to all relationships with the same level of alarm. Low-stakes connections, relationships that don't touch the deep attachment system, relationships where the feelings never rise above a certain threshold, those don't trigger the defense mechanisms. There's nothing to defend against. The wall doesn't need to go up because nothing is threatening to come through. You threatened to come through, or you already did. The depth of what you offered, or what naturally developed between you, activated their attachment system in a way it rarely gets activated. And an attachment system that rarely gets activated is also an attachment system that has never learned to regulate itself in the presence of real intimacy. It has no practice, no tolerance built up over time. It goes from zero to overwhelmed with very little in between. This is why the running often happens at specific inflection points, after a moment of particular closeness, after a conversation that went somewhere real, after physical intimacy, after a moment where they caught themselves feeling something they couldn't immediately intellectualize away. Those inflection points, the moments that felt like breakthroughs to you, were the moments that felt most threatening to them. What you experienced as the relationship deepening, they experienced as the ground shifting beneath them, as the thing they've been managing and containing starting to overflow the container. And the response to overflow, when you've spent your whole life keeping things contained, is not to find a bigger container. It's to put the lid back on. That's the running. That's what it is at its core. Not a reflection of your value, not a conclusion about whether you were worth loving. A lid, going back on a container that was never designed to hold this much feeling. What it does to you and why that matters, something needs to be said here that often gets skipped over in conversations about avoidant attachment. Because most of the focus goes on understanding the avoidant psychology. But you have been living inside this dynamic and what it does to a person to be close to someone, to feel the realness of what's between you, and then to watch them retreat from it is genuinely damaging in ways that compound over time. The first thing it does is make you doubt your own perception. Because the warmth was real, the connection was real, you didn't imagine it. But then the withdrawal happens, and it's so complete, so thorough, that you start to wonder whether you built the whole thing in your head, whether you projected meaning onto something that didn't have any, whether you were naive or desperate or simply wrong about everything. You were not wrong. The perception was accurate. The connection existed, but an avoidance retreat is so total that it can retroactively make everything that came before it seem like an illusion. That is one of the most psychologically disorienting experiences a person can have in a relationship, and it deserves to be named for what it is. It is not you losing your grip on reality. It is the natural confusion that results from being close to someone whose emotional world operates on a logic that has nothing to do with yours. The second thing it does is install a particular kind of hypervigilance. After enough cycles of warmth, followed by withdrawal, after enough times of being let in and then quietly shut out, your nervous system starts anticipating the withdrawal before it comes. You start monitoring, scanning, reading every silence, every shift in tone, every slightly shorter message for signs of the retreat. And that monitoring is exhausting. It is a tax on your emotional system that accumulates silently until you find yourself anxious in situations that should feel safe, doubting connections that are actually solid, bracing for abandonment in relationships that have nothing to do with this one. The avoidance pattern doesn't just affect the relationship it operates in. It reaches forward into every relationship you'll have after, and that is worth sitting with. Because part of understanding why this matters, why understanding the running matters, is recognizing that you are not just a passive recipient of someone else's attachment wounds. You are a person with your own nervous system, your own history, your own capacity to be shaped by what you experience. And what you've been experiencing has been shaping you in ways that deserve your attention. The misread, what most people get wrong about the running measure, here is where most advice about avoidant attachment makes a critical error. It frames the running as something to be solved, as a problem with a solution, as a pattern that if you just respond to it correctly, if you give enough space, apply enough strategy, become secure enough in yourself, will eventually stop, that the avoidant will run less, will stay longer, will gradually learn that you are safe and the closeness is safe and the feelings are survivable. And sometimes that's true. With the right conditions, over a long period of time, with an avoidant who has some degree of self-awareness and genuine motivation to grow, yes, the pattern can shift. Earned security is real. People do change, but the error is in assuming that your behavior is the primary variable. That if you calibrate yourself correctly, the outcome is in your control. That the running is fundamentally about something you're doing or not doing, rather than something happening inside them that predates you entirely and will continue to unfold according to its own internal logic, regardless of how perfectly you navigate it. This error is dangerous because it keeps you locked in a cycle of self-optimization that never ends. You become more secure and they still pull back. You give more space and they still deactivate. You remove every possible trigger you can identify and the running still happens. Maybe more slowly, maybe less dramatically, but it happens. And every time it happens after you've done everything right, the conclusion your nervous system draws is that you are fundamentally unfixable, that the problem is you at a level too deep to correct. That conclusion is wrong, but it feels true, and feeling true is enough to do profound damage. The running is not about you, and it is also not fully within your power to stop. What is within your power, and this is where the real conversation begins, is understanding what the running means well enough to stop making it mean something about your worth, and understanding what your options actually are, which are not the options most people assume they are. Because the choice isn't simply between leaving and staying, between accepting the pattern and refusing it. There is a third thing, a harder thing, that requires you to understand not just their psychology, but your own. To look honestly at what you're getting from this dynamic as well as what it's costing you. To ask whether what you're reaching toward is actually available. And to decide, from a place of clarity rather than desperation, what you actually want. That clarity doesn't come from reading about avoidant attachment. It comes from something slower and more interior. Something that requires you to turn the focus for a moment away from them, away from the running and the why of it and the way it made you feel, and toward yourself, toward the part of you that chose this, that stayed in it, that keeps returning to it, even knowing what it costs. Because that part of you has something to say, and it has been waiting, quietly, underneath all the analysis and the hope and the pain, to be heard. What it has to say is where part two begins. So you understand the running now, or at least you understand it intellectually. You can trace the line from their childhood to their nervous system, to the moment they went cold on you. You can see the mechanism. You can name the wound. And there's a particular kind of relief that comes with that. The relief of having an explanation, of replacing the chaos of not knowing with a framework that makes sense of it. But here's what happens next, and it's important to be honest about this. The understanding becomes its own hiding place. You take the framework and you use it almost without realizing it, to stay, to wait, to justify remaining in a holding pattern that has no guaranteed end. Because now that you understand why they run, leaving feels cruel. Giving up feels like abandoning someone who is wounded, rather than someone who is simply unavailable. The psychology becomes a reason, a sophisticated, compassionate-sounding reason, to keep orbiting something that may not be capable of giving you what you actually need. That is the trap that nobody warns you about, and it's where a lot of people spend years of their lives. So let's go deeper than the explanation. Let's talk about what's happening in you, not just around you, not just in response to them, but in the part of you that chose this person, that stays drawn to this person, that finds something in this specific dynamic that feels, on some level, like home. Why this feels like home when it shouldn't. There is a reason you are here. Not here as in this video, here as in this situation. Drawn to someone whose love comes and goes like weather, whose warmth is real but unreliable, whose presence fills something in you, and whose absence hollows it right back out. That reason is uncomfortable, but it is also one of the most freeing things you can come to understand about yourself. The pulls you feel toward an avoidant, the intensity of the attachment, the way the longing almost has a physical weight to it, the way their moments of closeness feel more vivid and more real than anything a consistently available person has ever made you feel. None of that is random. It is patterned. It is familiar in a way that goes all the way down. Familiarity and comfort are not the same thing, but the nervous system treats them as if they are. Whatever emotional environment you were formed in, whatever the texture of love felt like in the earliest relationships that shaped you, that texture becomes the template, not consciously, not as a choice, but as a kind of emotional home address that your attachment system keeps returning to, regardless of what your rational mind wants. For many people who find themselves repeatedly drawn to avoidance, the emotional template involves love that had to be earned, attention that was inconsistent, warmth that appeared and disappeared without clear logic, a caregiver who was sometimes fully present and sometimes entirely unreachable, and the helpless consuming effort of trying to figure out how to bring them back. Sound familiar? The avoidant doesn't remind you of that dynamic consciously. You don't look at them and think, ah, yes, this recreates the emotional landscape of my childhood. But your nervous system recognizes the pattern instantly, and it does something strange and counterintuitive. It settles into it, not because it's good, but because it's known, because uncertainty wrapped in intermittent warmth is what love felt like when love was first being defined inside you. This is not a flaw in you. It is not evidence that you are broken or masochistic or addicted to pain. It is evidence that you are human and that humans are pattern-matching creatures whose deepest emotional responses were calibrated long before they had any say in the matter. But here is why this matters so urgently. If the pull toward this person is partly, even partly, a pull toward the familiar shape of an old wound, then the work of understanding what's happening between you cannot stop at understanding them. It has to turn inward. It has to ask the question that is genuinely harder than any question about avoidant attachment psychology. What does this dynamic give you that you haven't been able to find elsewhere? The hunger underneath the hunger, there is the obvious hunger. The hunger for their closeness, for the version of them that lets you in, for the relationship to be what it almost was, what it briefly was, what you can feel it could be. That hunger is real, and it is legitimate, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But underneath it, there is usually another hunger, quieter, older, and this is the one that keeps the cycle running long after the obvious hunger should have exhausted itself. It is the hunger to finally win the love that once felt just out of reach, to be the exception, to be the one who got through where others couldn't, to finally resolve the ancient unfinished feeling of being almost loved, of being close to something that should have been safe and warm and permanent, but kept receding just as you reached it. The avoidant, without knowing it, becomes the stage on which that old story tries to rewrite itself. If you can just love them correctly enough, patiently enough, securely enough, if you can just be exactly what they need, then maybe this time the love doesn't retreat. Maybe this time the warmth stays. Maybe this time you are enough to make someone choose closeness over distance. And every time they briefly come back, every time the warmth returns after an absence, every time they reach out after going quiet, it feels like proof that you're almost there, that the resolution is just around the corner, that this time will be different, that intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable alternation between closeness and distance, is one of the most neurologically powerful experiences a human being can have in a relationship. It produces an attachment that is stronger, more consuming, and more difficult to detach from than the attachment formed in consistently loving relationships. Not because the love is deeper, but because the nervous system becomes fixated on the variable reward, on the chase, on the almost. This is not weakness. This is biology. This is the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Not the winning, but the unpredictability of the winning. The brain does not habituate to variable rewards the way it habituates to consistent ones. It stays alert, it stays hungry, it keeps reaching. And the reaching feels like love. It feels like devotion and depth and the willingness to fight for something real. And it is love, genuinely. But it is love that has become entangled with something older and more desperate than the present relationship can actually contain. What the running triggers in you and what that reveals when they pull away, when the running happens, whether dramatically or in the slow, quiet way of someone who just gradually becomes less available. Pay attention to what ignites inside you, not just the sadness, not just the longing. Go underneath those. What is the very first thing that fires? For most people in this situation, it is panic. A specific, particular panic that feels wildly disproportionate to what is objectively happening. Because objectively, a person going quiet or needing space is not a catastrophe. It is uncomfortable, it is hurtful, but it is not the end of the world. Except it feels like it is. It feels like something essential is being taken, like the ground is disappearing, like you need to act, right now, immediately, to stop something irreversible from happening. That panic is information. It is telling you something about what this relationship has come to represent that goes beyond the relationship itself. When someone's withdrawal triggers a response that feels existential, when the fear is not just, I might lose this person, but something closer to, I might not survive losing this person, that is the older wound speaking. That is the attachment system that was first calibrated in conditions of real emotional precariousness, now firing with the full force of everything it learned. The avoidance running lands on that old wound, like a key in a lock. And the door it opens is not just grief about this relationship. It is grief about everything this relationship unconsciously promised to resolve. The old feeling of being almost enough, of love being present but unreachable, of safety being conditional on performance. And here is where something genuinely important needs to be said, clearly and without softening it. That wound is yours to heal, not theirs, not through them, not by finally getting them to stay. The resolution you are seeking through this relationship cannot be delivered by this relationship. Not because they don't care, not because the connection isn't real, but because no external relationship, no matter how loving, no matter how consistent, can reach back in time and repair the place where the wound was formed. That repair happens internally. It happens through the slow, unglamorous, deeply personal work of building a relationship with yourself that doesn't depend on someone else's availability to stay intact. How you stop triggering the running and why that's the wrong goal. Let's address this directly because it is what most people come to this conversation wanting to know. If the avoidant runs from the ones they love most, if the running is a response to the depth of feeling rather than the absence of it, then what do you do with that? How do you stop being the person they run from? How do you become safe enough, grounded enough, unthreatening enough that the running stops? And the honest answer is a trap. Not because it's impossible to behave in ways that are less activating for an avoidant. Everything covered across these scripts is real. The chasing, the over-explaining, the agenda-driven giving, the silent tolerance, all of it genuinely escalates the activation in an avoidance system, and reducing those behaviors genuinely does reduce the pressure they feel. But if the motivation behind all of that adjustment is to stop the running, if the goal of becoming more secure, more grounded, more independent is ultimately to make yourself more attractive to someone who is currently unavailable, then the growth is not real growth. It is strategy wearing the costume of growth. And strategies eventually collapse. And when they collapse, everything underneath them, all the unaddressed need, all the accumulated grief, all the original hunger comes flooding back. And you're exactly where you started, except more exhausted and more confused about who you even are anymore. Real growth changes you regardless of outcome. Real security means you are genuinely okay, whether they come back or not. Not performing okayness, not strategically projecting okayness, but actually being in a place where your life has enough meaning, enough connection, enough forward momentum that one person's inability to stay doesn't define the entire landscape of your emotional world. That version of you, the one who has genuinely done that work, does tend to be less activating for an avoidant, does tend to create more space for them to come towards you rather than away. But that is a side effect of the work, not the purpose of it, and holding on to it as the purpose corrupts the entire process. There is also something else worth saying here, something that requires a particular kind of honesty. Sometimes the avoidant running is not a problem to be solved. Sometimes it is information. Sometimes it is the relationship telling you something true about its own limitations, not about your worth, not about the reality of the feeling, but about the actual present tense availability of this specific person for the kind of relationship you genuinely need. Availability is not the same as feeling. Someone can feel deeply for you and still not be available for you. Those two things can coexist, and spending years trying to convert the feeling into availability, trying to be patient enough, secure enough, understanding enough that the feeling finally translates into presence, is one of the quietest ways a person can lose an enormous amount of their life. What you actually deserve to know about yourself right now. You have been so focused on understanding them, on mapping their psychology, tracing their wounds, decoding their behavior, and that understanding has value, real value. But it has also perhaps been a way of avoiding the most important understanding of all. You are not a supporting character in their story. You are not the patient, loving presence whose purpose is to create the conditions for their healing. You are not a mirror, or a safe harbor, or a therapeutic relationship, or a test that they either pass or fail. You are a person with your own attachment history, your own nervous system, your own capacity for love that is enormous and real and deserving of somewhere genuinely safe to land. And the question of whether this relationship is that place, whether this person in their current state of availability can actually meet you where you are, that question matters as much as any question about why they run. You are allowed to want consistency, not performance of consistency, actual, reliable, sustained presence. You are allowed to want someone whose love doesn't require you to constantly calibrate yourself, monitor yourself, brace yourself. You are allowed to want love that doesn't feel like a variable you have no control over. None of that is too much. None of that makes you anxiously attached or emotionally demanding or incapable of handling complexity. It makes you a person who knows what love is supposed to feel like at its foundation. And it makes you someone who is, at some level, even through all the longing and the confusion and the grief, trying to find their way back to that foundation. That is not weakness. That is one of the bravest things a person can do in the middle of loving someone whose entire system is built to make love feel like it has to be survived. There is one more conversation to have, because everything in these first two parts has been about understanding them, understanding yourself, understanding the dynamic between you. And understanding is necessary, but it is not sufficient. What comes next is the hardest part, not because it requires more analysis, but because it requires something beyond analysis entirely. It requires you to make a decision, not about them, not about the relationship, but about yourself, about what you are willing to keep carrying and what you are finally ready to put down, about where the love you have, this enormous, real, exhausting love, actually belongs. That is where part 3 takes you, and it will not be comfortable, but it will be true, and true, even when it hurts, is always better than the particular kind of suffering that comes from living inside a story that was never really yours to begin with. You've done the hardest kind of thinking there is, the kind that doesn't just point outward at someone else's wounds and patterns and psychology, but turns around and looks directly at you, at why you're here, at what you've been carrying, at what the running has been doing to you underneath all the understanding and the patience and the love you've kept pouring into something that keeps asking for more without quite giving back enough. And if you've sat with all of that honestly, if you've really let it land, then something has probably shifted, not healed, not resolved, but shifted. A quiet, internal movement from confusion towards something that feels more like clarity, even if the clarity is uncomfortable, even if what it's clarifying is something you've been working very hard not to see. That clarity is not the enemy, even when it hurts, even when what it's showing you requires you to make choices you don't feel ready to make. Clarity is the first solid ground you've had in a long time. And what you do when you finally find solid ground, after so long in the uncertainty, is not collapse onto it, it's stand up. This is where we talk about standing up. The decision that isn't about them. At some point in every relationship with an avoidant, there comes a moment where the real decision reveals itself. And it is almost never the decision people think it is. Most people frame it as, do I stay or do I leave? Do I keep trying or do I walk away? Do I give it more time or have I given it enough? And those questions feel urgent and enormous and completely central to everything. But underneath all of them is the actual question, the one that doesn't have anything to do with them at all. Who are you when you are not in pursuit of this? Because here is what sustained longing for an avoidant does to a person over time. It gradually, almost imperceptibly, reorganizes your entire sense of self around the dynamic. Your emotional life starts to be structured by their rhythms, their warmth, their distance, their availability, their silence. Your inner world begins to take its cues from the outer world of the relationship. Good days are the days they were present. Hard days are the days they weren't. The texture of your life becomes determined by something entirely outside your control. And somewhere in that reorganization, you lose the thread of yourself. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet, incremental way that happens when you've been spending most of your emotional energy outward, towards someone else, toward the relationship, toward the problem of them, for so long that the inward landscape has gone unattended, unmapped, strange and unfamiliar in a way you don't fully register until something forces you to look at it directly. This is the real cost of loving an avoidant who has not done their own work. Not the loneliness, though the loneliness is real. Not the confusion, though the confusion is exhausting. The real cost is the slow erosion of your relationship with yourself. The way you become less and less legible to yourself. The longer you remain primarily focused on decoding someone else. The decision that needs to be made is not about leaving or staying. It is about coming back to yourself, to your own wants that have nothing to do with this person, to your own sense of direction that doesn't require their participation to be valid, to your own interior life that has been waiting quietly, patiently for you to return to it. That return is not abandonment of the relationship. It is the prerequisite for any version of the relationship that could actually work. The difference between acceptance and resignation. There is a particular emotional state that people settle into after enough cycles with an avoidant. It looks, from the outside, like peace. The urgency softens, the chasing stops, the constant monitoring quiets down, and the person mistakes this for acceptance, for having finally arrived at a healthy place of non-attachment and equanimity. But often, what it actually is resignation. And resignation and acceptance are not the same thing. They feel similar in the body. Both involve a reduction in active suffering, but they come from entirely different places and lead to entirely different outcomes. Resignation is what happens when hope exhausts itself. When you've wanted something for so long, tried so many approaches, cycled through so many rounds of closeness and distance, that the wanting itself becomes too painful to sustain. So you let it go, not because you've genuinely processed it, not because you've reached an internal resolution, but because the alternative is too costly. You stop reaching not because you're free from the need to reach, but because reaching has hurt you too many times. Resignation feels like peace because the active pain stops, but underneath it, the wound is still there. The unmet need is still there. The grief that was never fully felt is still there, preserved in a kind of emotional suspension. And it will surface eventually, in bitterness, in numbness, in a muted quality to your engagement with everything that follows, in a guardedness that you carry into the next relationship and the one after that, because something in you learned that wanting leads to this, and the safest thing is to want less. Acceptance is entirely different. Acceptance is what happens after the grief has actually been felt, not managed, not intellectualized, not reframed into something more bearable, but genuinely felt in all its weight and texture and specific sadness. Acceptance is what's left when you've allowed yourself to mourn not just the relationship, but what the relationship represented, the future you imagined, the version of them you fell in love with, the resolution you were hoping for. All of it. Grief is not a sign that you haven't understood enough. It's not something to be accelerated through or reasoned out of. It is the necessary passage between where you were and where you're going. And the people who try to skip it, who use understanding as a substitute for feeling, who intellectualize their way around the actual emotional experience of loss, tend to find it waiting for them further down the road, larger and more insistent for having been delayed. You are allowed to grieve this, fully, even if they haven't left, even if the relationship is technically still present in some form. You can grieve the version of it you needed, while still being in the version of it that exists. You can mourn the gap between what's available and what you deserve. That mourning is not disloyalty. It is honesty, and honesty with yourself is the most fundamental form of self-respect. What loving an avoidant actually requires of you the truth nobody says. Every piece of advice about loving someone with avoidant attachment eventually arrives at the same destination. Be more secure. Work on yourself. Don't chase. Give space. Be the stable, grounded, non-reactive presence that their nervous system can eventually learn to trust. And all of that is true, genuinely. But there is something missing from that advice that needs to be said plainly. What loving an avoidant actually requires, at the deepest level, is an extraordinary amount of emotional self-sufficiency. Not the performed kind, not the strategic kind, the real kind, the kind where your sense of okayness is genuinely not contingent on their behavior, where you have enough internal resource, enough genuine investment in your own life, enough authentic connection to other people and to your own purpose, that the avoidance rhythms of closeness and distance do not destabilize you. That level of self-sufficiency is not something most people have naturally. It is something that has to be built, deliberately, over time, through choices that consistently prioritize your own emotional development over the management of the relationship, through the willingness to sit with your own discomfort rather than immediately seeking relief from it through them, through the slow accumulation of experiences where you discover, over and over, that you are capable of being okay on your own. And here is the part that requires real honesty. Building that self-sufficiency while remaining in close proximity to someone who regularly triggers your deepest attachment fears is extraordinarily difficult. Not impossible, but genuinely significantly difficult, because the nervous system cannot easily build new patterns in the same environment that activates the old ones. It's like trying to learn to swim while regularly being held underwater. This is not an argument for leaving. It is an argument for honesty about the conditions under which genuine growth is actually possible. For some people in some relationships, with avoidants who have enough self-awareness and enough genuine motivation, the growth happens within the relationship, slowly, with enormous patience on both sides. For others, the growth requires distance first, not as punishment, not as strategy, but as the actual environmental condition that makes it possible to find out who you are when you're not organized around someone else's unavailability. Only you know which situation you are in, and the knowing requires a degree of ruthless honesty with yourself that is harder than any understanding of attachment theory. It requires asking not what you hope is true, not what you wish were possible, but what is actually, demonstrably, evidentially true about the current state of this relationship and this person's capacity and willingness to meet you. What the avoidant needs and why it's not your job to provide it. Here is something that is rarely said in the right way. The avoidant in your life needs something real. They need what every person with an insecure attachment style ultimately needs: the experience of a relationship that is safe enough, consistent enough, and low pressure enough that their nervous system can gradually learn that closeness does not equal annihilation, that needing someone does not end in devastation, that the walls can come down without the world collapsing. That is a real need. It deserves compassion. And in the right conditions with the right person over a genuinely long period of time, it is something that can be met within a relationship. But here is the boundary that matters. That need is not your responsibility to fulfill at the expense of your own. Their healing is not something you can accomplish for them, through them, or by reorganizing yourself around them. And a relationship in which one person's healing is purchased with the other person's ongoing unmet needs is not a loving relationship. It is a transaction, a deeply unequal one. And transactions, however well-intentioned on both sides, eventually produce resentment that poisons everything they touch. You cannot love someone into security. You cannot patience your way into being the exception to their pattern. You cannot be consistent enough, available enough, understanding enough to reach into their nervous system and rewire what decades of early experience embedded there. That rewiring, if it happens, happens because they chose it, because they did the internal work, because they came to understand their own patterns well enough to interrupt them consciously, because they found, through therapy or through their own sustained effort, the capacity to tolerate the intimacy they've been running from. None of that is within your power to give them. And trying to give it anyway, sacrificing your needs, your time, your emotional resources on the altar of their potential, is not love at its highest expression. It is love that has confused itself with rescue. And rescue, in the context of adult relationships, is rarely as selfless as it feels. It usually has as much to do with the rescuer's own need to be needed, to be the exception, to finally succeed where others failed, as it does with genuine care for the other person. That is not a criticism. It is an invitation to look at the full picture of what has been driving you, with honesty, with compassion for yourself, without judgment. Where the love actually belongs, you have an enormous capacity for love. That is evident. The fact that you are still here, still trying to understand, still invested, still caring about someone whose patterns make caring difficult and painful, that speaks to something real in you. Something generous and deep and genuinely beautiful. But capacity for love is not the same as obligation to spend it in a particular place. And love that is continuously poured into a vessel that cannot hold, it does not make the vessel more capable of holding. It just empties you. The love you have, this specific quality of attention and care and depth you've been directing outward, belongs somewhere. It belongs in your own life, in your own healing, in the relationships that can receive it fully and return it consistently. In your work, your creativity, your friendships, the private interior life that has been waiting for you to come home to it. It also, potentially, belongs in a relationship with someone whose attachment system does not require you to constantly manage your own needs in order to keep them from fleeing. Someone whose love does not arrive in waves you have to brace against. Someone for whom closeness is not a threat, but a destination they are moving toward willingly, consistently, without needing to be carefully handled into it. That person, that kind of relationship, is not a fantasy. It is not settling for something less intense or less meaningful. Intensity that comes from security feels different from intensity that comes from anxiety, but it is no less real. Consistent love does not mean boring love. It means love that you can actually rest inside. Love that does not require constant vigilance. Love that frees up the enormous amount of energy you've been spending on monitoring and managing and hoping, and lets you spend that energy on actually living. You deserve that, not as a consolation prize, not as the thing you settle for after this doesn't work, as the baseline, as the minimum acceptable condition for where your love goes. The last thing, there is no clean ending to this, no resolution that ties everything together into something that stops hurting. The avoidant in your life is real, and the feeling is real, and the grief, whether you're in it now or approaching it or trying to outrun it, is real. None of that gets neatly resolved by understanding it better, but understanding does give you something. It gives you the ability to stop making their behavior mean something about your worth, to stop reading their running as a verdict on your value, to see clearly, maybe for the first time, that the person who runs from the ones they feel most strongly about is not running from you. They are running from themselves, from the terrifying aliveness of genuine feeling, from the vulnerability of needing someone in a world that once taught them that need leads to pain. You were not too much. You were not the wrong person. You were not unworthy of the love that briefly, genuinely existed between you. You were simply someone whose presence activated something in them that they did not yet have the tools to survive. And you, with all the longing and confusion and pain this has cost you, you have been doing something that matters. You have been learning the difference between love that is familiar and love that is safe, between the hunger for resolution and the peace of actual belonging, between staying because you're afraid to leave and staying because you genuinely, freely, from a place of fullness rather than fear, choose to be there. That difference is everything. And now that you can feel it, now that you know what it actually is, you will not be able to unfeel it. That is not a small thing. That is quietly everything.